Welcome to How to Become a Production SQL Database Administrator. My name is Raphael. In this video, we're going to look at now the system databases and their role and functions. So every time you install any SQL Server edition, whether it be an Express edition or to the Enterprise edition, there are four primary system databases that are installed automatically for us. And these are the master, the model, the MSDB, and the temp database. Now, while I say there are four primary ones, since the Advent edition of SQL 2005, an additional system database has been added, and that's called the resource database. One thing to note about the resource database is that it's a read-only database and contains all the system information, much like the master database. It can't be backed up like the other some of the system databases can, and you must copy-paste the file if you want to make a copy. And this is actually the directory where this resource database resides. And I'll show you that in a second when we start looking at the individual databases. So just note that the resource database is an additional database, but it's hidden. And I'll be illustrating that in a second. So let's go back to the master database. So what's the function of master database? And these are obviously some of the relevant functions of the master database. It's a file location for other databases. So anytime you create another user-defined databases, all that information and configuration resides in this database right here. If you create logins and any relevant information to logins, then again, it's contained in this master database. As I mentioned, it does contain any server configuration settings. So anytime you change a configuration, we should always be backing up the database, and we'll be talking about that also. If you have a linked servers in your environment and you've configured it again, then that relevant information is stored. And then obviously the startup store procedures that start up the SQL itself resides here. So it's a very important database to maintain, to back up. And obviously without this database, SQL will not start. So this is a critical database. The model database actually is a template database that is copied every time a new database is created. And what I mean by that is think of a model template as a model database as a template. So anytime I create a database, it's going to copy the configurations of the model, and I'll be illustrating that to you in a second. So if I want to make any modifications to the template database that I want my new databases to have, then obviously I'll make the additions here, and they will be necessarily propagated to the new database, and I'll illustrate that in sections. So options set in model base will be applied to the new bases, as I said. The other function of the model database, it's used to create the temporary database. So every time the temp database is used, or started, I should say, then it's recreated using this model database. So that's a very important database to have, and we can back that up also. The MSD database obviously is a very critical database in that it has a tremendous amount of functionalities, and this certainly should be backed up also. It supports the SQL agent jobs. It supports SQL Management Studio configurations. If you've set up database mail, which we will, then obviously all that information and the table relevant to that is retained here. If we have this service broker, which is a messaging system, if that is activated and utilized, then again, all that information resides in this. And then obviously, it's the history of metadata information is available in the MSDB. And one of the most important things where you will be using the MSDB as an SQL production database is when you need to extract and analyze data for backup and restore histories of the database. And this database obviously contains that particular information. So that's a very important information for database administrators. And as I said, it contains the history of all the SQL jobs, alerts, and configuration, and so on. So again, this is a critical database also, and we should be backing this up. Lastly, the temp database. The temp database, as the name suggests, is a shared resource used by all server and all users. Now, this is a workhorse for SQL servers. There's a tremendous amount of activity that is going on here. Temp database used for temporary objects, work tables, online index operations, cursors, and so on. Snapshot isolation, version stores, retentions, and other things. It is recreated every time the server is restarted. So we cannot back this up, and obviously if we can't back it up, there's no reason to back it up. Every time SQL server starts, this is recreated based on the model database. So we cannot back to this, but it's a very important database to understand in terms of sizing and placement of its directories. And we mentioned that when we installed the SQL Server, but I am going to have several videos dedicated to what the importance is of temp database. As temp database is non-permanent storage, as I said, backup restores are not allowed, and we'll show you that in a second. One thing you'll notice here is that when we go to our SQL instances, one of the SQL instance you will see databases called report server and report server temp database, and on the other instance you will not see it, and I'm going to show you why we don't see that. There is also another database called replication system database. It's called the distribution, and it's only available when you configure that server for replication. Otherwise, it's not visible because we have not set up replication. And again, I'll show you that. And I've already spoken about what a resource database is. So now that we have a brief idea of what these system databases are and what their roles are, let's look at them in our SQL environment. So open your workstation here. Now you'll notice I have two instances going, SQL Server 1 and SQL Server 2. One thing I want you to note is that on SQL Server 1, you've got the system databases here. And as I mentioned, there are 5 system databases, but you're only viewing 4. The resource is, as I mentioned, hidden. So here they are. So this is the master, the model, the MSDB, and temp database. If I go to SQL Instance 2, just notice here I've got the report server and the report server temp database. And if I go to server 2, you'll see that they are not there. And that is because when we installed SQL Server, you have the option at that time to install SQL reporting systems. In this particular instance, I selected yes, and therefore I got these 2 databases by default added. In this instance here, I did not select SQL reporting services, and as you can see, those databases have not been created. So you only get report server and report server temp database created when you actually install SQL reporting system. So that's one of the differences here. So now let's look at some of the databases here. Obviously, as I said, the master database is a critical database to have. It's absolute that we maintain this and back this up, because any corruption of this will cause the SQL Server itself to fail. And like anything, it's got its own securities or security roles that we can add and so on. And I'm not going to really talk about security here, because when we get to security, we'll be talking about it. But just to note that this database is critical. The model database, as I said, is a template. And what I mean by that, for example, let's look at some of its properties and we'll get an idea. I'm going to take this model database, right-click it, and go to Properties. One thing I want you to note now is look at the file size. By default, let me go here, File Groups, Files. By default, the initial size of the data files is 3 megabytes, and the log file is 1. So if I create a database now, it will automatically emulate all the configurations that are here. So let's do that. I'm going to right click here, go New Database. I'm just going to go Admin. And you'll notice immediately that the initial size has been copied from the model template. And if I go OK, I'll just take a second to create that. So if I go to the properties here, and you'll know the size of it is 3 for data files and 1 megabyte for log file. So it's copying everything that we do to the model page. So now if I want to make so now let's delete this for a second. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually change some configuration. I'm going to change the size of the model database. So I'm going to go right click, Properties, Files, and I'm going to change that now to 10. And I'm going to change that to 5. 5 there, or actually, oops, 10. So now I'm going to go OK. So now remember, it was initially 3 and initially 1, and I'm going to go OK. So now that the model has been changed, and if I now want to create a new database, it will emulate whatever the model database is. So this is just one example, And obviously you can create functions here, store procedures, whatever you wish. The whole idea is that this acts as a template for the new database, and any configurations you want to propagate in the user-defined databases, this is where you can do it. So that's the purpose of the model database. The MSD database obviously is a critical database also, and if you look at some of the tables here, we'll know why. Let's look at the backup file. Obviously, if I go right click, select top 1000, obviously it retains information about all the backups that we do. So for example, let's just run it and look at this. So now if let's for example look at this one also, and now I'm going to back up the database right here. If we look at this version, let me just disconnect this. If we look at the backup set, this is all the history of all our backups. So right now I don't have anything backed up. So if I take master, go to tasks, and do a quick backup, go OK. Don't worry about the backups yet. We'll be discussed extensively. But now if I run this script, you'll notice that indeed I've got a record of that backup, and there is master full database. So again, you'll be most likely doing a tremendous amount with these backup files. Also, if we have log shipping set up, you'll be having a log shipping analysis here. The restores files are here also, and so on. So these are the ones that we'll be using, and I encourage you to just kind of navigate some of the familiar ones. But we'll be discussing these files a little more importantly. Now, one thing I want you to note is that the right-click tasks, I can back that up. What about the model? Right-click tasks, I can back that up. And same again for the task, I can back that up. However, when we get to the temp database, if I go right-click tasks, I don't have the options of backing up the data. And as I mentioned, the temp database, as this name suggests, is a temporary database. And every time SQL Server starts, it creates a fresh temp database based on the model. So there's no need to back it up. And as I said, you just can't back it up. But a temp database is a very important database, and I'm not going to spend too much time on it right now because, as I said, because it's a very important database to understand, I'm going to have several videos dedicated just to understanding what the temp database is. And again, this is the report server, and any relevant information for reporting when we start doing it is going to be here also. So I think I'm going to leave that here now and just continue on with the next video. But now you get an understanding of the system databases, what they are, their primary roles, and which system databases you should back up. And I'll be discussing the importance of backing up system databases on a daily basis, or at least the minimum of any time a configuration occurs or a change occurs. So if I create a new database or a new login, we certainly want to back that database and master database immediately, because now that particular information has been recorded and we want to keep that. So I think I'll leave it right here. I think that gives you a good idea of what the system databases are. As I mentioned always, I encourage you to read other resources also, but that should be sufficient to get you going of understanding system databases. And I'll leave it there, and I'll see you in the next video. So my name is Raphael, and this is how to become a production SQL database administrator.